Hi everyone, welcome to this video. This video is for you if you've painted with watercolor and someone told you to never use white watercolor paint. Chances are I'm the person that told you that. So in this video, I wanted to expand my horizons and maybe even show you how you can expand your watercolor palette by mixing different mediums into it. Watercolor paint into white watercolor paint, white gouache, white acrylic gouache, the bleed-proof white, and the Bombay India inks. Now these are just the white mediums that I happen to have in my possession. There are lots of other options out there, but this video will just cover these 6. I think you'll be surprised at the results and you might just find yourself buying one of these. So find all of the supplies in my description box and let's start experimenting. If you're new to my channel, welcome. My name is Audrey. I'm a teaching artist and I work primarily with watercolor, but I also dabble with gouache, color pencils, coloring with alcohol markers, and I also teach calligraphy. I have an online shop, so if you like my style, check it out. I sell stationery that are handmade from my studio and lifestyle goods like tote bags, tea towels, and mugs. Let's get into it. When it comes to watercolor, using white is sometimes seen as taboo. In this video, I want to explore what that means. And I also want to maybe suggest a solution for those who love watercolor, but also like the matte look of gouache, but maybe doesn't have the budget to buy all the colors of gouache out there. So I want to see how watercolor paint changes and looks when you mix it with different white mediums. All right, let's look at the watercolor paint just straight out of the tube. And I want to just do like a little value scale so you can see, just what it looks like, especially on black paper. So here it is at its strongest opacity, straight from the tube. My brush doesn't have a lot of water. Yeah, it's pretty thick, and that is quite opaque. I'm pretty impressed. Okay, let's wash it out just a little bit. I'm pretty impressed at how opaque this is. So now let's look at what it looks like when it's mixed into a color. So I have my quinacridone magenta here. I'm gonna bring in the tiniest amount over here. Brush is very dry. Bringing just a small amount of paint, mixing it in. Ooh, that is thick. Just incorporating it all in there. It's a really nice, like rosy pink color. Oh, wow. I wonder if this is so opaque because it's the Holbein brand. I could be wrong, but I think Holbein really likes opaque colors. Like a lot of my watercolors actually has the PW6 already mixed into them, and it creates, just beautiful pastel colors like this. I think this might be kind of unique to the Holbein brand, but I am quite impressed with this. It was really opaque. Let's see what that looks like on the white watercolor paper. So again, my brush is dry, picking up what's left of this paint up here. Oh, you know what? I'll do another test up here, the first row of the pure quinacridone magenta. So I'm gonna just leave a little bit of space there. Yeah, wow. Yeah, great coverage. It just looks really good. Okay, this kind of makes me want to see what it looks like with other watercolor white paint. I'm really curious now. Oh, great.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
Okay, so because I am curious and I have this, I also have the Shinhan Professional Watercolors, and this is also white. And as you can see, I have not used any of it. So let me do one more test. Okay, but before I do that, let me do the pure quinacridone magenta here. Pick up this paint. It's very, very thick. Yeah, wow. Let me set this aside for just a moment. Now I only have 5 of these, so I'm going to use the lid for the Shinhan. All right, let's do the same. So I'm going to put the white here. Again, just straight from the tube. No, now see, this is not as opaque. Like I can already tell. Oh, actually this kind of dried a little bit less opaque. That's interesting. Now let's mix the two. Something about this though, I feel like it definitely does dull the color. So maybe what I'll do at the very end is kind of compare the actual gouache color. Okay, so let me do that in just a moment. Okay, here it is on black. I don't know, it's really interesting so far. Let's just do a quick comparison of these two brands. So we've got Holbein here on the left, Shinhan on the right. I feel like what I'm seeing, and it might just be, and I know I tried to use the same amount of paint mixed in, so don't be confused by like this looks more purpley than this one. I don't think that's the point. What I'm trying to look at is the level of opacity. So at least in the Holbein, yeah, even though the strongest is pretty opaque, I can still see some of the black showing through. And obviously it gets worse and or more transparent as you go down. And then same thing with the Shinhan. I feel like the level of opacity is probably just slightly less than the Holbein, but it is still quite opaque, but again, not as opaque. In terms of what it looks like on the white watercolor paper, I feel like there is better coverage with the Holbein. There's just more even coverage as well here on the Holbein swatches as opposed to the Shinhan. Wow, this is very interesting. So again, later on, I'll grab the same kind of pink color that I have in the actual gouache in towards the end, and then we'll do a final, comparison of everything. But for now, let's pause here and just keep going with my other white mediums. All right, next we have the regular gouache. All right, let's mix the two. I wish I could stop the experiment right now, but I have 3 other mediums to get through. But this is the reason why you want to add white gouache to your watercolor paints instead of white watercolor paint. So again, let's compare the Holbein gouache to the Holbein watercolor. Let's just look at the white ones so far. So the gouache is at the top, watercolors in the bottom. Like you can already tell that even when the gouache mixture is watered down a little bit, there is still a lot of coverage. Whereas the watercolor, like already by the third swatch, I'm already seeing streakiness. There's difference in values, whereas this is very clean throughout. And if we were to compare it on the black paper, again, there's a little bit more coverage in the first 3 swatches than there is compared to the white watercolor. So very, very interesting. I gotta keep going though. Oops, that just came out like a giant blob. Now with acrylic gouache, it should be made permanent, but I also wonder because I mixed some watercolors into it, I don't know if that's going to compromise the acrylic-ness of it or the permanence of it. So I wonder if I can still reactivate it with water. So we'll have to see. Even with acrylic gouache, like it's really not meant to be used when it's really washed out like this. So I'm looking at the, strongest opacity, and it's such a smooth, clean color, like really, really smooth. Like if I compare it to the Holbein gouache, again, don't mind the color, right? But just looking at the opacity, like this still has very consistent coverage compared to the acrylic gouache. Now that could just be human error, like if this doesn't look consistent, but just right off the bat, yeah, this is still the most consistent. Let's keep going, 2 more. So it's kind of goopy when it's inside the jar. And then you can add just a little bit of water to just, make this a little runnier. But you don't want to add too much because then, again, you'll lose the opacity. From the palette. Very interesting. It's definitely still very smooth consistency. I don't know what to make of this. This is really interesting. I feel like this changes my game. Last but not least, let's do the Bombay India ink. This is probably the most fluid out of all of these white mediums. I did try to shake it up as best as I could. Oh, so fluid. It's actually thicker than I thought it was going to be. Yeah, it is a little thicker. But it's definitely the least opaque, which is as suspected. Very fluid, quite transparent. Some magenta here. Yeah, it's very smooth, but as you can already see, like pretty transparent. Although on the white watercolor paper, it actually still looks a little bit okay. Let me find my pink gouache and then let's add that to all of our papers as well. So I found a pink gouache. This is the color Rose. I know it's definitely going to be really bright compared to these, so that's okay. But I also have my watercolor Brilliant Pink color, and this actually has some of that PW6, the white watercolor, mixed into it. So let's actually put both of them on the papers and just see what they look like. Okay, I wasn't sure if I could fit all of this on here, but I did. I think my purpose of doing this experiment was that I just wanted to see like how well watercolor mixes with other paint mediums. I really feel like watercolor is so versatile, and everyone says that mixing white watercolor paint with colored watercolor paint is a big no-no. So then what can you do if you wanted to make it more pastel? So I thought that gouache would be a great way to get pastel colors without having to mix white into them. But I kind of wanted to see what it does look like when you mix in different whites into it. So again, over here we have the first one that we did, the Holbein and the white watercolor paint. This is the Shinhan brand with white watercolor paint. This is the Holbein brand gouache paint. This is the Holbein brand with acrylic gouache. This is Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. And then the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay India ink. And then I also did a swatch of the gouache rose and the watercolor brilliant pink color, just so you can see like what it looks like if you weren't going to mix white into it. So let's look at each of these individually and then kind of compare and etc. So again, this is a watercolor Chinese white mixed into the quin magenta. And the quin magenta on its own, yeah, it is pretty opaque, but you know, once you start watering it down, like it creates that beautiful luminous, you know, watercolor, which is what you really want. The Chinese white watercolor isn't fully opaque to begin with, and then it obviously, you know, starts trailing down in value immediately once you add water into it. And this is why pure gouache is like so important, because yeah, like even if you add just a little bit of water, you still get really great coverage than when you were to mix the white watercolor paint into the Quin Magenta watercolor. So this is already an example of why white watercolor paint isn't that great. And so if you are going to add a white medium, then what would you add? Maybe the gouache or the acrylic gouache, etc. So maybe one of these other options. I had to lift a little bit because it was still wet and I was being impatient. So don't mind that little lifting area. The watercolor brilliant pink color here is quite opaque because again, it does have PW6 mixed into it. I'm assuming it's this PW6. I'm not sure if it's the Chinese white or a different white watercolor paint, but I know that there is some white mixed into here. And so that's why even when you water it down, it still kind of retains that pastel look. So here it is with the Shinhan white watercolor paint. Yeah, this one, you can definitely see the streakiness. So the quality is not as great compared to the Holbein. Yeah, the white watercolor paint did not do a really good job. So again, it's not the end of the world. Like if you don't want to buy gouache and if your tube set came with a tube of white, I mean, experiment with it. You know, I'm not saying don't, but I do feel like that there are better options. So let's look at the gouache then. So this is just a Holbein gouache. I feel like this probably could have been a little bit more opaque. Maybe I just didn't add enough enough of the white or enough of the paint on my brush. But just look at how like much brighter these colors are, like even when they're watered down, and the coverage is just like really full. On black watercolor paper, anything watered down doesn't look great. So let's don't worry about that. So let's compare the gouache then with the white watercolor paint. The differences are not as obvious. Obviously the white paint though, there's a huge difference. The white gouache is a lot more opaque than the watercolor. And then if you just compare this second row with this second row, like do you see how with the gouache, there's again just more even coverage, and even down here, like it's very subtle, but it's still more coverage and more matte than here. And it still feels like a brighter color. I know it's so subtle, but to my naked eye, this gouache mixed into the Quin Magenta watercolor paint is slightly, just slightly more luminous than this one. I feel like it retained the color of the Quin Magenta better here. So again, it's very subtle differences. So that's why I'm saying like you don't have to get the white gouache, but I think if you really want like strong results, go with the gouache. Let's look at the acrylic gouache then. I thought titanium white was supposed to be pretty opaque because I think zinc white is supposed to be more transparent. I could be wrong though, but this is just what I see. I don't know if it's just the way that I painted or maybe my paint is going bad, but I feel like there's some graininess to my paint. I don't know, maybe it's just in my eyes. But anyway, so let's look at these. Yeah, again, just pretty good coverage. It's a little bit streaky, probably just because of human error. So let's compare the acrylic gouache then now with the regular gouache. So this is acrylic gouache and the regular gouache in my left hand. I do feel like there was more consistency with the regular gouache in terms of the color, the paint flow. Yeah, but once you get down to like it's really watered down state, it's kind of the same. But I do feel like just because the Holbein regular gouache is just more opaque than the acrylic gouache for some reason. Actually, it's about the same. It's very comparable, very comparable. So I guess the main difference between the acrylic gouache and the regular gouache is that this should be more permanent. Let's do a reactivation test to see how well this stands up. So again, yeah, that would probably be the biggest difference. I feel like other than that, they are almost the same. All right, let's look at the bleed proof white. I was actually quite impressed with this. I didn't think that it would get such an opaque color, but it did. I mean, just look at this. Like, I feel like it's very close to the gouache. I mean, just look at that. The coverage is very clean. Yeah, once you kind of water down though, you do see the difference in the consistency. So it does lose its opacity like pretty quickly. But in terms of the full strength, I mean, that looks amazing. So we'll do a lifting test on this one as well. And last but not least, let's look at the Bombay India ink. Now again, these are inks, so they were a lot more fluid. And yeah, it watered down very quickly. And even at its full opacity with the mixture, it's still very streaky. You can actually see the black color showing through. So yeah, it's not quite as opaque. This is the least opaque out of these 6 options. I feel like the color is still pretty bright, but if you want the full opacity, then yeah, you don't want to use the inks. So let's do a quick lifting test on the acrylic gouache, the India inks, and the bleed proof white, because we know that with the gouache and the regular watercolors, they're definitely going to reactivate. So I'm not going to bother lifting those, but let's do it on here. So again, this is for the acrylic gouache. I'm just curious to see if mixing it with watercolor will change the permanence of it. So for this white, just pure acrylic white gouache, it should not reactivate. Okay, so it is a little bit, so I'm a little confused. It shouldn't have reactivated. Let me do it on this mixture down here, because now I'm afraid that it is going to reactivate. I mean, very minimally, but it is reactivating. Yeah, can you guys see that? Yeah, it still is. So I don't know why this reactivated. It definitely shouldn't have. It's very minimal, but it is reactivating. I'm a little confused. I thought this was supposed to be pretty permanent. So this is just regular watercolor, so that is going to reactivate. But let's look at the mixture here. Yeah, it's definitely reactivating. Yeah, you can see that for sure. So mixing acrylic gouache doesn't necessarily make it, 100% permanent. It's reactivating less obviously than it would if it was regular gouache or regular watercolor. That is for sure. Let's look at how the bleed proof white reactivates. So this is just the regular bleed proof white. Oh, that reactivated super fast. Okay. So then let's look at the mixture part, which should, yep, reactivate just as quickly. Okay, let's look at this mixture. Yep. So the bleed proof white is not permanent either. Okay, now let's look at the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay India inks. These should be waterproof. At least it says it's waterproof on the packaging. This should not reactivate. Oh yeah, I am really scrubbing here, but there's nothing. Nothing. Very good. So now let's see how it stands up to when it's mixed in with watercolor. Oh wow. Yeah, it's not reactivating at all. Oh my gosh. Okay. I thought at least maybe some of the pink pigments would reactivate, but wow. Okay, there's just a slight pink halo here only because I'm really forcing it, but it's really, yeah, it's quite permanent. Okay. That's good to know. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I know it was kind of long and pretty laborious, but sometimes I like experimenting like this because I get to know more about my paints and the other supplies that I have, because that could inform, how I use them in the future. I'm still on the fence about, using white watercolors because I really don't like how it does dull the color. And I think from brand to brand, it's also going to be different. So I only looked at 2 brands that I currently own, but if you look at other brands, their white watercolor paint might be different. I remember having a white pan watercolor paint, and that was really bad. So I definitely do not recommend using white watercolor pan paint. But perhaps the tubes are not half bad, because as you can see, you can still get really bright colors. It doesn't dull it as much as I thought it would. But I think if you want the opacity to, be there for longer, even if you water down the color, then I think you really need to go with the gouache or the acrylic gouache. Now, the main difference between these two is that, yeah, I thought the acrylic gouache would be less prone to reactivating, but it's still reactivated. I think between these two, I would invest in just a regular gouache because this will also be easier to wash off than acrylic gouache because these, again, have acrylics in them. So it's basically plastic. But it was kind of cool to, and I didn't realize how runny acrylic gouaches. I always forget that they are a little bit runny in consistency compared to the regular gouache. So I think that also contributed to it looking a little bit streaky and like washing out like a lot faster. The gouache really does the best job in terms of maintaining its opacity and maintaining the color vibrancy. I really was surprised by them. I didn't realize how well the bleed proof white would retain its opacity as well. And the Bombay India ink, yeah, it is truly waterproof, but it doesn't maintain its opacity, and it's going to be a little bit streaky if you have too much water or just too much of the ink and you're not spreading it in thin layers. Now, if I were to layer on top, would that change the opacity? Yeah, of course. But, just straight out, first layer, like you want it to be quite opaque. So I hope this was helpful, especially for those who are watercolor painters and may want to explore slightly different styles, like a more matte and flat style, which is what gouache is known for. And so I hope it was helpful so that you can see, should I add white watercolor paint or should I add gouache or acrylic gouache or any of these two? I think if you want to explore gouache and you currently are a watercolor painter, try just getting a small tube of white. You don't need this giant tube. This is 60 milliliters. This is more than you'll ever need. So this is a 15 milliliter and this is a 5. Yeah, this is a 5 milliliter. So just get a 5 milliliter tube of white. Oh, actually this one. Yeah. Well, this is the white watercolor paint, but try getting just a 5 milliliter or a 15 milliliter tube of white gouache and then start mixing it into your watercolor paint and just see what happens and see if you like that style, because then if you do, then I think it is worth investing in like actual gouache paints because then you don't have to constantly mix it with your white paint. So that's one reason why I would suggest, yeah, just starting out with one white tube of gouache paint and just mixing it into your regular watercolor paint and see how you like the result and the color that you see on the paper. It was kind of fun, like bringing back some of these supplies that I haven't used in a long time. I actually just published a video about our supplies that are collecting dust, and this was on the list as well as the bleed proof white. So I'm glad that I actually took them off the shelf and used it for this demonstration. So let me know in the comments if you use white watercolor paint and how you use them. And if you have never used white watercolor paint, let me know why, and if you would try mixing white gouache into your paint. Leave a white heart emoji if you watched all the way to the end of this video. Please make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. I love doing videos like this, so stay tuned for more. I'll see you guys next time.